A young man named Tadeo Fulgencio Mejia laid in bed inside of this big, expensive mansion that he'd recently bought in Guanajuato, Mexico. And Tadeo was feeling really miserable because he was sick with a fever. And so he rolled over and he let out this long, agonizing sigh, and then he heard his wife, Maria, come into the room. And he looked up and he saw that she had a cup of tea in her hand, and she walked over and she set it on his bedside table. And even though Tadeo, he really felt physically terrible, it was like the instant his wife was right next to him, taking care of him, just her presence, it made him smile. Now, Tadeo and Maria had actually only recently gotten married, but Tadeo was like head over heels in love with her. She was smart, she was fun, she was very caring, she was beautiful. And so far, their life together, despite it being relatively short so far, had gotten off to a really nice start. So Tadeo had not been born wealthy, but he had worked his way up to becoming a very successful mining engineer. And then after becoming very wealthy and successful, he had met Maria, fallen in love with her, they'd gotten engaged really quickly, and Tadeo had actually bought her this huge mansion they were in right now as a wedding present. And this mansion, this home, really was ideal for both of them, not just because it was a beautiful, grand home, but also because the town it was in, Guanajuato, was where Tadeo worked. And it was also where Maria's whole family lived, so it was perfect. Plus, the neighborhood was clean, it was quiet, it was safe, and the neighbors, for the most part, were all also upper-class professionals just like Tadeo. So they fit right in. So for Tadeo, his amazing wife, his big house, and his nice neighborhood, those all felt like symbols of his great success. So, on this night, although Tadeo did obviously feel very sick, he also felt really proud and very satisfied with his life. And so right after his wife sat down next to him on the bed, Tadeo sat up, he smiled at her again, and he grabbed the tea she had brought for him, and he took a sip of it. And then Maria, she smiled back at him, but then she looked at him with an almost apologetic look on her face and said that, she did have to go right now, or she was going to be late for dinner with her family. And when she said this, Tadeo felt a little bit uneasy. So Maria went to her family's house for dinner a lot, since they lived walking distance away. But normally, Tadeo physically walked her there. Because to get to her family's house, Maria had to leave their safe neighborhood where they lived and pass along a couple of sketchier streets. And so Tadeo was always concerned that if she was walking in those areas without him, that she might get mugged or attacked or something. She was vulnerable. But Tadeo clearly was just way too sick to walk her that night. And so he told her that he was really worried about her going alone, but Maria sort of brushed him off and said, everything was going to be just fine. Then she leaned over, she gave him a kiss, and she said goodbye, and then she got up, she grabbed her handbag, and he watched her leave. A few hours later, Tadeo was still in bed, sort of half asleep, when he heard these sudden, frantic knocks at his front door that didn't stop. Somebody was banging on his door over and over again. And Tadeo's first thought was that it must be Maria. But Maria obviously had a key to their house, so he didn't know why she'd be knocking. But the knocking sounded so panicked that he immediately felt like something must be wrong here. So even though Tadeo was very groggy still and quite feverish, he leapt out of bed and rushed to the door and flung it open. But when he looked outside, he didn't see Maria. He saw a small group of his neighbors, and they all seemed really freaked out, like something had happened clearly. And one of them actually looked at Tadeo with tears in her eyes, and she said that Tadeo needed to come with them. Just minutes later, Tadeo was led over to the entrance of this alleyway that was right outside of his nice, quiet neighborhood. And over here, there were all these people that had sort of swarmed around the entrance to this alleyway. And as soon as he got there, Tadeo could see that the alleyway itself was swarming with police. And so Tadeo, he pushed through the crowd because he's starting to panic, like, what's going on here? Where's Maria? He gets through the crowd and he looks into the alleyway. This is his first unobstructed view. And it's very clear that in the middle of the alleyway, something's on the ground. And when police sort of stepped out of the way, he could tell what was on the ground was his wife's body. Maria had been stabbed in the back, and she was now lying face down on the pavement, surrounded by blood. Tadeo was so shocked and still so feverish that it's like he couldn't even process what he was seeing. I mean, it all seemed like this just had to be fake or something, like this can't be real. So when a police officer came over and asked Tadeo if he was the victim's husband, All Tadeo could do was just slowly nod and just stare at his wife's body. And then, at some point the officer asked him, like, where were you tonight? Do you have any idea what happened to your wife? But Tadeo, it's like he was hearing these words, but just couldn't process it. And so he didn't say anything. He just continued to nod and just stared at his wife. Later that night, Tadeo was back at his home, just sitting on his couch in a total daze, just shivering. He was shivering from his fever, from the sweat that was all over his body, and he was also just shivering from coming down from having this huge surge of adrenaline after seeing his wife dead in the alleyway. But more than anything, he was just like frozen. He could barely remember even getting back to his house. And so now he just sat there, like he had no idea what he was going to do. But eventually his body became so exhausted that he just shut down, he keeled over on the couch, and he just passed out right there. And at some point in the night, Tadeo began having this horrifying fever dream. In this dream, Tadeo was looking out the window from his living room and he could see Maria. And she was stumbling down the road and there was this huge trail of blood behind her and she was screaming for Tadeo to help her. And then suddenly Tadeo woke back up again and he found himself sitting on the couch and he sort of took stock of where he was. He realized that was just a dream, and then he realized he was drenched in sweat and his heart was racing. Like, that dream felt so real. But then as he was just sitting there in stunned silence, just sort of processing that that really was a dream, he heard something that immediately gave him goosebumps. He could hear somewhere in the distance the sound of his wife's voice calling his name. Over the next few days, Tadeo's fever went away, but his fever dreams or his nightmares he was having about his wife calling out for him, those didn't stop. And every once in a while, when he would wake up from one of these horrible nightmares, he would again hear the sound of Maria calling to him. And it was always so clear. He knows he's awake again. He knows he's not dreaming anymore, and he would hear her voice. He was certain it was her. But he could never tell where the sound of her voice was coming from after he would wake up from these dreams. He couldn't tell if she was calling from outside the house or inside the house, or if it was just in his own head. But it didn't matter. Every time it felt so real. Like, that was not a part of the dream. That was real life, and it was terrifying. At the same time that Tadeo was grappling with the loss of his wife, and he's having these terrible nightmares, and he's trying to pick the pieces of his life back up and put them back together, he also was going to the police to try to get more information about what happened to his wife. What did they find in the alleyway? Who could have done this? What happened? But unfortunately, the police really hadn't learned much so far. They didn't know who did this, they hadn't found a murder weapon, and they told Tadeo that when they found his wife's body, she didn't have any personal belongings near her. And Tadeo said, well, she should have had her handbag. She left the house with her handbag. She should have had it with her. And so the police said, well, no, it wasn't there. So maybe what this is just a robbery gone wrong. And they took her purse and they killed her in the process. Now, Tadeo didn't doubt that that could have been what happened to his wife. One of his chief fears about his wife walking alone in those sketchier neighborhoods was the fear that she might be attacked, she might be mugged. And so very likely that could have happened. But Tadeo wanted the police to fully investigate and figure out, who did this? Was it a robbery gone wrong? He wanted to know for sure who did it, find them, bring them to justice. He wanted answers. And the police were very committed to trying to get him those answers. But unfortunately, days turned into weeks, turned into months with no updates, and Tadeo was left feeling what's going to happen here? Have they forgotten about my wife? Is there just nothing? Is no one going to be held to account for what happened? And so after a few months of just relative silence and just feeling like he can't move on with his life without some sort of closure here, Tadeo found himself feeling overwhelmed by really three emotions. There was grief over the loss of his wife. There was anger at what he viewed was just ultimately police incompetence or police, laziness or deprioritization of his wife's case. And guilt, because in a way, he did feel responsible for his wife's death. If he had just sucked it up and, despite being sick, walked her to her family's house, maybe he could have protected her. Also, he thought about the fact that he was the one who bought this house. And so in virtue of putting her here, she had to walk that route to see her family. And so in that way as well, he jeopardized her safety. He sort of pushed her into the environment where she was killed. And so he was feeling really, really guilty. And so because of all these horrible feelings Tadeo was feeling, combined with still no word on who actually did this to his wife or why, Tadeo felt like he was basically losing his mind. He stopped going to work and instead just spent all hours basically sitting in his living room, staring out the window. It was like there was some part of him that thought if he just waited long enough, he would see Maria walking down the street towards him, calling out to him like he had seen her so many times in his nightmares right out this window. And at the same time, Tadeo more and more was convinced he could hear the sound of Maria calling out to him, basically at all hours. Whether he had just come out of one of those awful nightmares, which he was still having, or if it was just the middle of the day and he's just sitting there looking out the window, like not asleep at all, he would still hear her voice. Didn't know if it was inside the house, outside, in his head, he didn't know, but it was like she was constantly on his mind, either because he was waiting to see her out the window or he was waiting to hear her. It was like all-consuming. Maria was the only thing he thought about. And eventually, Tadeo began to believe that the reason he was feeling the way he was feeling was not just overwhelming grief, like the dreams he was having, the nightmares, like hearing his wife calling to him at all hours and believing he was going to see her out this window, that wasn't grief. That in fact, it was his wife's spirit contacting him, that she was basically telling him that she cannot rest until her murder is solved. And Tadeo, when he realized that that was what was going on from his perspective, he realized that he had to take matters into his own hands. He needed, for the sake of his wife, to solve her murder so she could finally rest. And so Tadeo, he retraced his wife's steps, he interviewed his neighbors, he searched all over town for her handbag and for the knife that was used to kill her. But despite how motivated he was to try to solve this thing and do right by his wife, he didn't uncover anything new. There was no new leads, no new evidence, no clues, nothing. It was one dead end after another. However, over the course of Tadeo's investigation into his wife's death, one thing did become increasingly clear, and that was Guanajuato was not nearly as safe as everybody thought. First, a drifter passing through Guanajuato was kidnapped. Now, nobody really connected this to Tadeo's wife's murder, at least not at first, because this person who went missing, they were never found. And so it was not really clear what happened to them, wasn't clear if they were killed, there was no clear overlaps between this person and Maria. And so at first it was just this thing that happened in Guanajuato and nobody connected it to Maria. But then about a week after that person got kidnapped, another woman who lived on the outskirts of town, she disappeared. And then just days after that, another man went missing. Now, in each of these 3 new disappearances, none of them were found. They literally just disappeared, and that was it. Nobody knew what happened to them. But, as Tadeo is out there talking to people and trying to figure out what's going on with his wife, more and more people in town began to say, this is not a safe place. What if there's a serial killer on the loose here, and your wife could have been the first victim, and now they're refining their methods and they're taking people away and they're killing them and they're not even being found. That was the consensus in town. And so Tadeo, he's hearing this new theory about a crazed killer from the people in town, and he's still continuing his own investigation, but it's basically going nowhere. The police are still not giving him anything. They're continuing their own investigation. They're hearing about this killer theory, but that's going nowhere. And so basically Tadeo didn't know what to do. He felt like there's a whole lot of things that could have happened, but nobody really knows. However, he wound up having a conversation with a very unlikely person just a few days after that third person went missing. And this conversation inspired a brand new approach for how Tadeo would figure out what happened to his wife. It was an extreme idea, one that he certainly hadn't thought of himself, but as soon as he heard it, he felt like, this is what I gotta do. The next day, Tadeo walked down a residential street in Guanajuato towards the sprawling, beautiful, expensive-looking home. His heart was racing, so to calm himself down, he put one hand into his pocket, and he felt the cold metal of the gun that he had brought along. So after his conversation the day before with this unlikely person, Tadeo had completely changed his investigative approach. And now he was fully convinced that he was right on the cusp of finding his wife's killer, and that the answer was actually inside of this very expensive-looking home. That's why he'd brought the gun. And it was also why now he went up to this house and he turned the front doorknob, and he found it was unlocked, just like he knew it would be. Then, without knocking or announcing himself at all, Tadeo walked inside of this house, he shut the door behind him, and he went directly to a staircase that led down to the basement. And standing at the top of these stairs, Tadeo felt a rush of conflicting emotions. He was so scared that he almost wanted to turn around and run out of the house. But he was also so grief-stricken and so desperate that he felt like this was the only way he would ever find the truth. So he took a deep, steadying breath, and then he walked down the stairs. And what Tadeo saw in the basement looked like a scene out of a horror movie. It was almost completely dark down there, except for some flickering light from a couple of tall black candles. On one side of the room, from what he could see, there was what appeared to be several mangled human bodies stacked up in a pile. And on the other side of the room was like this bizarre occult altar. And on this altar, there was a long knife, some kind of a book, like a spell book, and a chalice that was filled with human blood. And then also painted on the wall above this altar was a red pentagram that clearly had been drawn in blood as well. And so Tadeo, he just stood there for a moment, staring at the bodies, staring at the altar, the pentagram, and it was just quiet for a moment. And then there was the sound of a single gunshot. It didn't take long for the police to show up at this beautiful residence after a neighbor had reported hearing that single gunshot coming from inside. Officers pounded on the door, and when nobody answered, they just went inside. And once inside, the police found the home was very quiet, very still. They looked around on the whole first floor, but they didn't see anything unusual. But then one of the officers found a staircase that led down to the basement. And so down they went. And when they reached the basement, they saw the same horrible scene that Tadeo had. I mean, it basically is like this occult lair down there, complete with bodies and blood and altars and all this terrible stuff. But there was something else in the basement that the police saw that Tadeo did not. So it would turn out that when Tadeo began his own investigation into his wife's death, when he began hitting one roadblock after another and he's not learning anything and it just feels like one big dead end, well, when that happened, he was so frustrated but so determined to know what happened to his wife that he turned to a local witch and he asked them, "Hey, is there any way for me to contact the dead directly? Like, can I talk to my wife and have her just tell me who killed her? I have to know who killed her. Like, can you do that for me? She's already whispering to me. I'm already having these visions in my dreams of her. I know she's there. I just need some help. I gotta have this conversation with her." And the witch is like, "I have just the thing. There's a ritual you can follow that if you follow all the steps exactly, you can have that interaction with your dead wife and you can get the information you're seeking." And so the witch gives Tadeo this list of very specific instructions, which included human sacrifice. And Tadeo, he takes down all the instructions and then he sets out trying to perform this ritual. He goes out and he kidnaps that drifter, the first person who went missing from town. Tadeo kidnapped them and did kill them for this ritual, but after following all the steps, Tadeo didn't get to talk to his wife. She didn't appear. She didn't tell him who murdered her. And so what does Tadeo do? He goes out and kidnaps somebody else in town, that woman on the outskirts of town. He kidnaps her. He kills her for ritual number 2. But again, despite following all the steps, he couldn't contact his wife. It didn't work. And so he goes out again. He kidnaps that man and he kills him. And he performs the ritual for a 3rd time and it still doesn't work. And so what does he do? A few days after that 3rd person disappeared and everybody in town is freaking out about a serial killer because there actually was one, it was Tadeo. He speaks to the witch again and says, "Hey, your instructions aren't working. What do I got to do to talk to my dead wife here?" And the witch says, "Well, there's one other way you can perform this ritual. You can be the sacrifice." And Tadeo, he's thinking, this is pretty extreme, but I want to figure out what happened to my wife. And so Tadeo, the now known serial killer, wanders into his own house. His house was the big, beautiful house, into the basement of his mansion where he was keeping the bodies of the people he was killing. And he had his ritual he performed on the altar. And he goes down there and he ritualistically kills himself in order to connect with his wife. And so he shoots himself and he dies. And then the police show up a little bit after. They come into the basement, they see this horrible scene, and what they saw that Tadeo didn't was his dead body in the middle of the floor. And so in the end, Tadeo literally became a murderer. He killed 3 people. He ended his own life, all in an effort to try to figure out what happened to his wife. And what happened to his wife is it actually was just random. It was a robbery gone wrong. On the night of April 2nd, 1899, a cowboy named Charles Casimir rode his horse through a blizzard near Lyman County in South Dakota. He was following another cowboy named Frank Heppa, who was also on horseback. So Charles and Frank were both employees at this large ranch, where typically they would work with a big team. And they had come out here with a big team, but they'd gotten separated from the rest of their group while tracking down some missing cattle. And so now they were looking for somewhere to take shelter from this huge storm, which had sort of come out of nowhere. And Charles was terrified as he rode through the storm, but not because of the storm itself. I mean, he had ridden through any number of big storms in the past. He was a rugged guy, and even though this storm was quite bad, that wasn't what was making him so fearful. What really bothered him, what really unsettled him right now, was the fact that he was out here just with this guy Frank by himself. He was like the last person he wanted to be around alone. So 5 years ago, Charles knew that Frank here had been charged with murder for brutally killing his business partner over an argument about money. Now, Frank had gotten off by claiming self-defense, but as Charles had heard it, that was pretty much impossible, and he just couldn't understand how Frank had gotten away with it. Because Frank's partner, the guy who had been killed, had literally been stabbed in the back. So how is that self-defense? So ever since Charles had heard the story about one of his coworkers, he'd avoided working one-on-one with Frank. And fortunately, most of the time he was in a big group, and so even if Frank was a part of that group, he was never isolated with him. But the snowstorm had thrust Charles into sort of a worst-case scenario. Bad storm, isolated with a potential killer. And on top of that, because of how bad the visibility was in the storm, Charles didn't even know where they were. I mean, he was lost. But as he was riding along behind Frank, despite all the issues he had with him, he did appear to know where he was going. And so Charles, he didn't want to freeze to death out here, so he ignored his fears and continued to follow Frank. And for a while, that's just how it went. Frank leading, Charles following, in relative silence, like not much communication between them, the storms blowing all around them. And then eventually, Charles started to notice that his horse seemed to be getting really tired. And like that would be a really big problem if his horse couldn't continue. And it didn't appear like they were near any structure or any landmark or anything. I mean, Charles doesn't know where they are. Again, Frank appears to have a sense of where they're going. But right as Charles was really starting to get worried about his horse, basically not being able to make it, suddenly this structure sort of appeared out of the darkness up ahead of them. They really needed to get out of this storm or else they could freeze to death. And so this was life-saving. But that also meant that Charles now would not only have to be alone with Frank, but he'd have to be alone with Frank inside of a small space. And so even though Charles knew he couldn't turn this down, he had to go or else he could die, it was like, with a lot of reservation, they go inside of this building. A half an hour later, Charles was stoking a fire inside of the shack's fireplace and was waiting for the place to heat up. But already it was so much better than being out in the storm. And so as Charles is sort of looking around and Frank's getting his gear together on the side of the shack, Charles noticed that there was lots of dust built up on everything, suggesting that nobody had been in here for a long time. This was maybe an abandoned place, he didn't know. However, when he made a comment to Frank about that, saying, how lucky it was they found this place, this rundown, abandoned place, Frank corrected him and said, actually, no. Luck had nothing to do with it, and this is not really an abandoned place. Frank said the reason he knew this house would be here is because he used to live here. At first, Charles was like, oh, that makes sense. That's why Frank knew where he was going. That's how he was able to navigate the storm and get us here, because he used to live here. And so at first, Charles is like, oh, cool, that makes sense. But then he's thinking, wait a minute. I know that Frank's business partner, who Frank killed, whether it was self-defense or just premeditated murder, clearly Frank did do the killing of his business partner. It happened, apparently, according to the story, inside of Frank's house. And Charles is looking around at the dust on everything inside of here, and he's thinking, wait a minute, clearly Frank hasn't lived here recently, and he's saying he used to live here. Is it possible that this shack is where the killing happened? Is this where Frank killed his business partner, this small space? And at this point, he looks over at Frank, who's now sitting on a stool by the fire, and he's eating some beans out of a can, and he's sipping some whiskey from his flask, acting totally unbothered about potentially being in the exact space where he killed somebody, potentially. And Charles, it was like he had these spiraling thoughts of fear. Like he's looking at this guy who he doesn't want to be around. He's in a place where maybe he's killed someone, and it was like too much. He became completely overwhelmed and just knew he had to go. He had to go out of the shack and just get away from Frank. He didn't even care that there was a storm raging outside. He just had to get away. And so really, without coming up with a plan at all, Charles just looks over at Frank and he's like, I'm going to go outside and get a breath of fresh air. And then before Frank could say or do anything, Charles just turned around and walked out the door out into the storm. Now, once Charles was outside, despite the storm raging all around him, he immediately felt a sense of relief, because, anything was better than being inside of that horrible place with that horrible person. And so he began walking over to the horses just to check on them, and again, just kind of collect his thoughts and just kind of center himself before he figures out what he's going to do next. And he's walking over to the horses, and as he's about to grab the first horse, he hears something behind him. The next day, not far away from the shack, a couple of ranchers were fixing a fence that had been damaged by the big storm when they spotted a cowboy off in the distance who was on horseback riding through the snow. And the cowboy, it looked like something was wrong with him, like he was very weak or something, because he was kind of slouching to one side like he might fall off his horse at any moment. So the ranchers got on their own horses and they rode over to him, and when they pulled up alongside of him, they thought, we were right to come over here because this guy is a mess. His lips were blue, his eyes were wide, and he was just staring off into the distance like he was in some kind of shock. And so quickly, the ranchers pulled this guy off the horse, they wrapped him in a blanket, and after a couple of minutes, that look of shock on his face began to fade, and color returned to his face, and they gave him some of their hot coffee, and after a minute or two, this guy began to talk. However, when they asked him, what happened? Why are you out here? What's going on? All the man would say is that he wanted to bring them back to the shack where he had spent the night before, because apparently something really bad had happened inside. And so eventually this guy, this cowboy, climbed back on his horse, and he began riding back in the direction of the shack, and the ranchers followed along. And pretty soon, as they were getting closer to the shack, the ranchers began to look at each other with these kind of worried looks, because they realized what shack he was likely bringing them to. They knew that shack. So these ranchers had lived in this area for years, and 5 years ago, they had helped the local sheriff clean up the aftermath of a grisly murder at a nearby shack, Frank's shack. And the murder was Frank's business partner. And so these ranchers had literally seen the body of the victim, covered in blood, the knife still in his back, lying face down on the ground in front of the fireplace. And so now, as they were nearing where they knew this shack was, that's all they're thinking about. How is it possible that this guy is saying something bad happened and he's bringing us to the site of this grisly murder? It just felt really unsettling. And so sure enough, this cowboy leads these ranchers back to the very shack they know so well where that murder happened 5 years ago. The cowboy gets off and he leads them inside, and the ranchers, they're looking at each other like, what are we going to find inside of here? What's going on? And they walk into this little space, this little shack, and they can't believe what they're looking at. It was like the most intense, really awful deja vu. On the ground, in the middle of this cabin, lying face down with the head near the fireplace, was the body of a man covered in blood with a knife plunged into his back. And so the ranchers, they look at the body, and then they look over at the cowboy who's led them here and shown them the body, and he's not putting up any sort of fight. And the ranchers, they put their hands on their guns, and they look to the cowboy, and they're like, who did this? Were you the only one here? Was anybody else here last night? What happened? And the cowboy, all he said was, no, it was just me. I was the only one here besides, him. And so the ranchers at this point, they didn't even know what to do. So they just walked over, they grabbed the cowboy who didn't resist, they tied him up, they brought him outside, they put him on one of their horses, and they brought him back to town, and they handed him over to the sheriff and said, he's a murderer. 2 months later, in June of 1899, a grand jury met to discuss this case, and they were immediately struck by just how closely the facts in this case matched the case from the stabbing 5 years ago. The details were basically identical. You have two cowboys who walked into this particular cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and then one of them turns up dead with a knife in his back. Just, it happened on 2 separate occasions, 5 years apart. However, there was one major difference between the first instance and the second instance. This time, in the second instance, the dead man was Frank Hepa himself. The very man who had been the killer from the first case was the victim in the second case. The cowboy that the ranchers had found, who was on death's door with blue lips, who led them back out to the cabin, that was Charles. And so today, during this grand jury hearing, when Charles took the stand, the jurors were expecting him to say that yes, he had stabbed Frank, because who else could have done it, but that it was very likely done in self-defense. That was their expectation of what he would likely say, because it was really the only explanation Charles had that might get him off the hook. But when Charles spoke, he did not claim self-defense. Instead, he told a story that was arguably the least believable defense he could have possibly given. He said on the night that Frank was killed, he had panicked because he had realized he was inside of the very shack where very likely this guy had stabbed to death his former partner, and he was just so frightened by the whole experience that he decided to go outside, get a breath of fresh air, to just get away from Frank for a second. And Charles would say, like, he didn't even have a plan. He didn't know if he was going to come back in or if he was going to leave. There was obviously a storm going on. But he said he left the cabin, and he knows Frank is the only one inside of the cabin at this point. Charles goes outside, he's making his way over to the horses, and as he's about to grab that first horse, he hears something behind him, and he says he thinks it's Frank, and he whips around, but there's no one there. There's no one outside. However, he notices in the window of this shack, this cabin where he's just come from, he sees what looks like a shadow moving near the window. And then he hears loud commotion inside of the cabin. He knows Frank's alone in there, but he doesn't know what's going on, and so he runs back over to the cabin just out of curiosity. He opens the door back up and he looks inside, and it's just Frank. But Frank is now face down in the middle of the cabin with his head near the fireplace, and a knife is plunged into his back, and there's nobody else inside the cabin. And immediately Charles said he felt like he knew what happened. Frank clearly has been killed by a ghost, and he was so scared, so unbelievably perplexed at what he was seeing, that in a true panic, he just turned, fled the cabin, hopped on a horse, and just started riding away with no plan. And it was only by pure luck that the next day those ranchers found him before he just collapsed and died. That was his defense. So a claim like this, that Charles, was basically saying, I didn't do it, a ghost did it, was so sensational that naturally this immediately attracted a whole bunch of media attention. And for the most part, the journalists that flocked into the area to cover this trial, they expected to hear a whole bunch of sensational testimony in addition to this initial claim. They were, expecting to hear lawyers sort of poke apart this whole story and just have it be kind of a circus in the courthouse. But that eventually, the truth would come to light that, of course, Charles, he did this. He must have stabbed Frank. Who else could have done it? It couldn't have been a ghost. And then very likely he would be found guilty, he'd be hung, and that would be that. But that's not what happened. At the very last moment, Charles was told he was free to go. The grand jury had decided they were not going to pursue charges against Charles. But this meant, at least in the eyes of the very astonished people that heard about this, that had been following this whole case, that in essence, by doing that, the grand jury was siding with Charles and basically saying, yep, must have been a ghost. That's what did it. And that just seemed so absurd that these, rational members of the grand jury, who were mostly comprised of, very practical, hardened ranchers from the area, how could they possibly really believe that a ghost did this? But that really is what they believed. That is actually the reasoning they gave for why they did not pursue Charles. They believed his story. A ghost must have killed Frank. But they have a very specific reason for believing that. There was one fact that ultimately pushed the jury to believe that. And that fact was this. 5 years earlier, when Frank stabbed his partner, whether it was premeditated or self-defense, doesn't really matter. What we do know is he definitely stabbed to death his partner. When he did that, the knife he used was taken into evidence, and it was given to the prosecution, who put it in a safe, and they kept it there for the trial. But on the night before the trial began, the knife inexplicably disappeared from the safe. And the prosecution said, no one's opened the safe. No one has access to this safe. Like, there's no way anyone could have that knife other than the prosecution. And the prosecution is like, we didn't touch it. We did not move that knife. We have no idea what happened to it. And so basically, no one knew what happened to the knife. It just went missing, and they carried on with the trial without it. It was like, okay, crazy anomaly. It is what it is. However, the knife would turn back up again 5 years later when it was found stabbed into Frank Heppa's back. Now keep in mind, Charles didn't even know Frank when Frank was accused of murder. Like, he wasn't even following the case. Why would he have stolen the knife from the prosecutor's safe? Or how could he? Like, Charles has no connection to this knife whatsoever. And so basically the jury was left with like, well, wait a minute. If Charles didn't have this knife and he didn't do this, is it possible that maybe the victim's ghost is the one who stole the knife in the first place, and then 5 years later exacted their revenge on their killer, Frank, by killing him the same way they were killed with the same knife in the same location? Well, it's up to you if you want to believe that story, but what is the case is that line of thinking was the actual literal reason that Charles was let go. They basically said, yep, a ghost did it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time.